You're listening to an Anazao Ministries podcast.
Does theology matter? Is there a point to just studying things about God? Well, have you ever wondered if you really need it or not? If you have, then you're looking for a podcast with all the answers about why we study theology that's going to help you better understand your faith. Then you've come exactly to the wrong place. Sorry. But if you're looking for a show, it's going to ask questions and struggle with differing opinions from smart theologians who are way smarter than you and I, that maybe it's going to leave you completely clueless, then you found the perfect show for you. This is a show designed to give you more questions than answers. I am Joshua Noel, and I'm just a dummy who loves God and theology and hopes to show my love for God by studying and thinking deeper about topics that people smarter than me have been thinking about for thousands of years now. If you followed the show at all, you might be wondering why it's been so long since we had another episode. I've been swamped. I've been overwhelmed, but I'm back. I'm going to this show. I'm helping with a few other shows, getting them back on the show. So if you've been following the network and you notice a few are missing, it's because I'm involved in a lot and I've been busy. So I haven't been able to do as much as I would like, but you're going to see more of the shows coming back, picking back up. One of the other reasons I really struggled with this is actually just, I struggled with content. I had writer's block, making these outlines, putting stuff together. And I'm thinking, now what? For a long time, those first two verses, it's mentioning God. So who's God? It's mentioning time. So what's that? It's saying the earth was void and formless. Okay, what's that about? Talking about water. Okay, let's talk about the waters. And eventually I get to a point where I'm like, I can't do this with every verse. I'm actually kind of running out of material. And the next thing was like humans. And I'm like verses later. And I'm like, hey, the structure that I originally thought was going to work perfectly for this show isn't working as perfectly as I had hoped. And I had a little bit of writer's block and also was busy. And also the other shows were being dropped and I felt bad. And I was like, I don't know what to do. So I've come up with some thoughts. I've actually been a little inspired. I've picked back up and I actually have, we're seasons now. So what we've been doing, this kind of immediate stuff of like defining theology, defining God, this Genesis 1 thing, all that's going to be considered season 1. So I'm going to do this episode. We're going to talk about why have theology at all. And then next episode is going to go to what does it mean to be human? God created them, man and woman. That's part of Genesis 1. So we're going to go there. We're going to talk about the doctrine of man. We're going to cover a little bit of that. And we're going to call it season 1. I'm going to take another week or two off. And I know you're like, oh man, it's been months off already. It's okay. I promise it'll be fine. I will pick back up now that I have a plan. My schedule's a little bit easier. I don't think it should be a very long break before season 2, which I thought was going to be a really quick season because I was like, oh, I'm just going to go over some logical fallacies. And we're going to look at some of the big arguments in church history and decide whether or not this fallacy is being used and whether or not it would be important to know this when we have these discussions for ourselves of whether or not we think it makes sense. Then I realized I ended up settling on 16 fallacies, 17 or 18 episodes that I want to do because we're going to define what fallacy is. And at the end, we're going to kind of just think back and look at this. It's still going to leave you confused. It's not going to give you any answers, but maybe it'll give you a tool for how you come to the answers yourself. So we're going to be going through logical fallacies. That'll be season 2, lasting about 18 weeks. And then season 3, which again, I planned ahead for this just because I thought season 2 was going to be short and I was wrong. It's going to be Taylor Swift theology. I know that sounds crazy and you guys think I'm stupid and you're already tuning me out and you're like, I'm not listening to season 3. Hear me out. Part of why I'm mentioning it is because of what we're talking about today. If theology is useful, then it should speak to the human experience. And what Taylor Swift does really well is talk about human experience. That's why so many people like her music. It's because it's relatable to stuff that they're going through. So if theology is in fact practical, we should be able to go through her music, see what human experience she's describing and she's feeling. And we should be able to find ways that theology actually applies to that, or else we have to determine that theology is in fact not as practical as we thought. So I think it'd be worthwhile going through, and that'll probably be just as long as season 2. So probably another 18 episodes or so. And I don't know what'll happen after that. That's just where we're at as far as what I think is going to be good for our show going forward. Still staying confused, still struggling with questions, not coming up with answers, and still wrestling with theology and smart theologians that come before us, but with a little bit of a different structure, just kind of going forward here. And it's part of why I do this podcast, because I do think theology is important. So a little bit, I am actually going to give my stance for once this time. I try not to do that kind of stuff because this is supposed to be where I leave you with questions. Sorry, Christian, but I think it is important that you guys know that. I think theology is important, but I also think there is a legitimate question to ask that we should struggle with on why is it important? How is it practical? How is it useful? I don't think it's an easy question. A lot of times you just get people who are like, well, because thinking of God is still worship and you should worship God by thinking about him with your whole heart, mind, soul. And hey, listen, that's a fine answer, but it's not fine for me. Like I want I want an explanation of how is this useful, and just to say, because it's useful when you pray or when people ask you about God, for me, that's still not good enough. I want real reason why this is practical in my life. And I think it's important to look at this. Yes, I do lay on the side of it is important, but I think it's still important to wrestle with people who've argued that it isn't, and really thinking about their perspective and thinking, hey, what if I'm wrong? What if it's not important? I think that's also an important thing to think about and to discuss. So we are going to look at the two different sides of this. We're going to look at whether or not it's practical. My first question, though, before any of that, before we just kind of discover, does theology matter? We have to wrestle with this idea of we've already talked about what theology is. There's an episode for that. Go back and look at it. But I want to ask, is it possible not to have theology? Is it possible to not in some way practice theology? I think every human alive at some point has thought there is or is not a God. In our world today, it's hard not to because religion is so prevalent. And as soon as you've had that thought, that's theology. It's hard not to think these are the values that are more important. Humanity has always thought of stuff like, hey, love is more important than money, right? This idea is greater than this substance. And as soon as we're having those kind of things, we're putting these values, these spiritual kind of ideas ahead of tangible matter. In a way, that's theology. So when we're thinking of theology, and yes, that's the study of God, we're also thinking of the study of things of God, which includes beauty, includes love, and includes all of these things. I'm not entirely sure it's possible for a human to not have some form of theology. I think every human has looked up at the skies and thought, what if there's more? And as soon as you do that, if you're not thinking aliens, I think you're practicing theology. Good or bad theology, still theology. So we got to ask now, does theology matter? Is that something that we should just be resisting? Because even though it's human nature, maybe it's not particularly useful human nature. It doesn't help me live a better life. It doesn't help me love my wife better. It doesn't help me make more money at my job. It doesn't help me, progress in society. So how is it useful? So now I want to go to an interesting question. Who was the first theologian? Now, subjectively, if we're going with the stuff that I talked about, Adam and Eve or whoever the first humans were, are the first theologians because they thought, hey, what if there's a God? Boom, that's theology. But more traditionally, there's two different answers to this. There's a few different answers to this, but there's two main ones that I think are worth observing and thinking about today. So one, a lot of people will actually argue that Plato was the first theologian. And when we're talking about this, we're usually referring to specifically systematic theology. So obviously, if you go throughout the Bible, there are people who are, hey, here's this doctrine, here's what we think of God, here's what we think of this, but they're not putting together in a system, whereas they are talking about the relationship to God, talking about the history of God. They're not systematically putting together, here's who God is, let's think about this in this way. First people to really do that, as far as we're aware, were the Greeks, and then some of your early church fathers. So a lot of people are going to say Plato was actually the first theologian. Other people are going to argue Origen, who, if you didn't know, was convicted of heresy. So our first theologians aren't typically the best Christians you think of all the time. There's a lot of controversy around Origen. I actually really like him. In my opinion, he's way better than Thomas Aquinas. But there's different ways of looking at this as far as who was the first theologian. We're going to specifically today, we're going to look at Plato, and then we're going to look at Saint Origen, or just Origen, however you want to say it. It's probably pronounced Origin even. I don't know how to pronounce things. I'm just a dummy, remember? So I just always see the name spelled, and I never hear it said very often. My bad. So let's first think about Plato. How could Plato be considered the first theologian? Well, really goes back to this idea of like being theology doesn't have to just be we're thinking of God. It could be the things of God. And when you look at a lot of what Plato did, he thought of forms, he thought of ideas of things that are beyond just our human experience. And why I think his story is actually really interesting for our discussion is how often he was challenged that his thoughts, his things that he were doing was completely useless. They said, hey, listen, this thing that you're grabbing of like, what is the idea of beauty? That might be fine and good and all, but it doesn't help me with feeding my family and we're starving, right? And hey, what you're doing here of like imagining what is the good, that's great. That doesn't help me figure out how to fight this war. You know, these kind of things. These are what ideas that were being thrown at Plato, and he was constantly being accused of not being it, not doing anything practical, because all he was doing was philosophy or theology, if you will, because he's thinking again of the things of God, even though he wouldn't have attributed them to God. Again, that's why he's labeled him, but he wasn't doing theology as far as he was aware. So I wouldn't personally consider him the first theologian. Maybe you would. Maybe you would consider Origen like me. Who knows? Again, I'm just a dummy. That's up to you to decide. Was it Plato? Was it Origen? Was it Adam? Was it someone else? Who knows who the first theologian was? But I think it's important to think about Plato and what ideas he was struggling with that people were accusing him of doing something that was impractical and how he combated that. So a lot of his stuff was revolved around what we call forms, or what he called forms. When he talked about forms, it was a very interesting idea. So a lot of our ideas of evolution might have come from this, actually, because he had this idea. I forget what example he might have used horse. I'm going to use dogs because I think it's just easier in our context. You say there is form of a dog, especially if you're listening to this just audio, it's going to really help you kind of imagine better, I think. He says, when we see a Chihuahua, or maybe not a Chihuahua, when we see a Dachshund, when we see a Great Dane, when we see a Dalmatian, when we see a Beagle, I have a wonderful Beagle at home. I love him. His name's Copper. We see all these things. They all clearly look different. They're clearly not the same, but we can look at them and think dog. And to remind you, this is before scientific, names were attributed to anything. We didn't have any scientific reason to believe these things were related, but we can look at them and go, yep, dog. They all fit the form dog. So how he would define this is Beagle, Dalmatian, they think they were particulars that were all representing or reflecting the form we know of as dog. And then he would take this further and further. He said the same thing can apply. We might think this woman is beautiful. We might think that Disney World is beautiful. We might think the New York City is beautiful. I don't know how you would, but some people find the city beautiful. Maybe a waterfall, maybe a specific island. I love going to Cumberland Island. It's my favorite camping spot. When I'm there, it's beautiful. But I can't say Cumberland Island and my wife are the same. But I think of them both as beautiful. So they're both particulars that are reflecting this form that maybe they are also reflecting other forms, but when we think of beauty, it is a form that they both are reflecting in some way. So my wife, Cumberland Island, maybe for some people, New York City, these are particulars that are reflecting a form. And then he'll go one further still. We think of beauty, intellect, some of these others that we already said were forms. They're still reflecting of yet another form that he says is the form of the good. Beauty is good. Well, how do we know what good is? We have this understanding of what this form is, even though we can't define good very easily. Same thing with intellect, same thing with all these other things. So even though they are, beauty is a form of which my wife is a particular, it is also a particular of which good is the form it is reflecting. The reason he argued that it was actually important to think through these philosophical ideas. So let's say family, that is a particular. Your family is different from my family, from whatever. But if we're able to observe and agree on what is the idea, what is the form that family should be, then we're all able to try to reflect that the best that we can. So again, beauty. We want to reflect beauty. We want to reflect love. But ultimately, we want to reflect good. So we need to be able to define these philosophical or spiritual even, maybe some people would say theological ideas, because if we can define those, if we could think about them and really have a grasp on what we think the ideal form is, then we can reflect it better in our lives. So he thought it was practical to think of what is good, because until I do that, My life that I am actually living right here on the ground is just going to be my life. But if I have an idea of what good is, I can aspire to that. So that's why he argued that forms were important. And I think I have to agree. I think it's important to think of who God is, of who humans were made to be. I think it's important to think of what sin is. I think it's important to think of like, what are the heavens? Because it helps us aspire to what we need and what we want. And also to resist what is wicked, what is evil, what is sin. Until we are able to define these things on a philosophical or theological level that maybe isn't practical in itself. But once we have that defined and we have the forms, we're then able to aspire to those, and that aspiration is practical. So we need to have these forms, these ideas, so that we have something to aspire to. Again, that's Plato, and I fully embrace his ideas there. I think he's right. I also think that's why Plato's description of not Jesus, pretty damn close to Jesus for a reason. All right, now let's talk about another person who might be the first theologian, Origen. He's actually talking about God. He's talking about Jesus. He's talking about these things, but growing up in the Greco-Roman world, he's also doing it through a very philosophical mindset. So marrying this idea of the Bible, of God, of the spiritual to philosophy, he comes up with his own kind of systematic theology. Origen's really interesting because he was labeled a heretic for a couple reasons, and it's very heavily debated. It seems like it might have actually just been because him and the Pope at the time just didn't really mesh, But some of the actual reasons given, one was because he was a universalist. He actually thought that all would be saved. Again, and the Bible does say in Romans, just as all have sinned, all will be saved. But also there's a lot of places in the Bible that talk about a hell, that talk about a place that maybe you could go, that kind of disputes this idea of universalism. Again, I might have to do this on another episode because we can't answer that question either. That's a big question mark that we're still arguing about, whether all are saved or some are saved, whether hell exists, or if it's an idea, what is hell? These are all doctrines that one day we'll have to get to. Another thing was they accused him of some stuff about what he believed about God that wasn't necessarily his actual beliefs. But Origen did take the Bible. He came up with thoughts and he thought through, here are these implications. Here's what I think actually happens, and what God, Jesus, the Bible is all about. If we use reasoning, again, and we're going to get into this next season when we talk about some of the structured logic, we take logic, we take the Bible, what comes out the other end when we put it through these formulas. That's what Origen did, and he did it beautifully, but he was labeled a heretic because some of his ideas, universalism, and the other heresy was, and I thought this was right, but I had to double check. Origen supposedly taught that God was incorporeal. As in that God wasn't tangible, that you couldn't just see him. Again, going back to forms, he existed in another reality or above our reality. Like God didn't just simply exist in a physical bodily form. That's something that he taught. The people accused him of Gnosticism basically because of that, but he wasn't saying Jesus did not have a body. He was saying that God did not have a body. Supposedly, again, we don't have all these documents to really be able to verify a lot of this stuff. People thought that was a heresy because God had to be somewhere tangible that we could see and grasp. We don't believe that now. So again, I think Origen should be in the clear, but hey, that's still up for debate for several other reasons too. There was tons of reasons why some people thought Origen was a heretic, but he thought deeply about the things of God. That's what got him in trouble, because before him, and again, think about this. If we didn't have all the theologians before us, if I didn't have all these thousands of years that I'm pulling from, no one has systematically put together what the Bible meant in a lot of ways. He doesn't have an idea of original sin to go off of. Doesn't have an idea of who God, what the Trinity actually means to go off. He has like conversations that other people are having, and like feels vibes that people had about the Trinity, but he didn't have anything defined. So if you put yourself in his position, you are the first person to use logic and philosophy to take the Bible and systematically put together thoughts of what really is Christianity. I'll tell you, mine would have been so much worse. Like a hell of a lot worse. I have no idea what I'd come up with. I'd probably be like, God, first off, let's just establish God's not a pony. Yeah, let's put that out there. Because I'm a dummy. So I have to go to really basic things because I couldn't come to a lot of the stuff on my own without really someone else. And that's what he was doing. He had this incredible, impossible task in front of him to put together these things. But he thought it was important to do so that when people encountered Christianity, it wasn't just vibes, feelings, and stories, but we were able to point them to a system and say, here's what we believe, here's why we believe it. And for those who do believe it, to have a system that says, I believe this thing because of not only the Bible, but because there's logical and reasoning. And I'm able to use that and with the Bible to come up with an idea to aspire to. And again, that aspiration is what's practical, not necessarily the theology itself. So that being said, I want to look at a few other parts of this. So we're going to go to some systematic theology. I want to think through some different things when we're going through this. Systematically, what we have to look at is, why do we study God if God is unknowable? I think that's a big question. What is the point of studying someone who we have established is unknowable? We know that one of the attributes of God is he's immutable. A lot of people argue whether or not he's omnipotent. He's spiritual and physical, some people. But we also say that God is unknowable because our finite brains cannot comprehend what is not finite. So what's the point of studying someone or something that we cannot grasp totally? And how can we tell if something's just a thought experiment or if it's an exercise in understanding the forms of God for us to model and aspire after? Because sometimes it's just like, hey, how many angels can fit on a pin? Which is a really fun conversation. I'd love to have it with you. But the answer to that doesn't come up with a form or an idea for me to aspire to, which is something fun. So how do we make these differentiations to decide when is our theology actually practical, something to aspire to, and when is it just, we're doing this for kicks and giggles, which is fine, by the way. It's fine to do it for kicks and giggles. It's a fun thing to do. I love theology. But if we're talking about when is it practical, we have to think about when does it create something to aspire to? And how much does it hurt your brain to think of something that you can't think of? And what is the point of even trying? Again, I think if it's coming up with nothing to aspire to, that there's a point. If it's not, what's the point? I don't think there is one. Okay. And then, of course, we have to talk about practical theology. And we're talking about whether or not theology is practical, which is an entire branch of theology, is practical theology. So there you go. How has theology personally made any differences in my life? This is the question I would want to ask. If I'm looking at myself, how has this made a difference? And it has made a difference in a few different ways. That cheesy answer that I kind of mocked at the beginning is actually legit. For me, I grew up in a charismatic church, Pentecostal church, and I didn't have a lot of influences telling me that I need to think about this thing harder. Rather, my influence were saying, pray more, feel more. We speak in tongues. We're all like things that were prioritized, which I think are important things. But because I didn't grow up with it, when I went to college, and the professor who said, hey, this is a form of worship, just thinking about God. Man, to me, that opened up a whole door. It's why I care so much about theology. It's why I care about whether or not it is practical. It's why I care about all these things. Because at the end of the day, even though maybe that's an answer that doesn't suffice, for me, I need more than that. If you're going to ask the question, why is theology important? I need more than just that answer. But that answer is still true and it's still valid and something that's deeply personal to me. Because for me, when I discovered that, I was able to worship in a whole new way, and it brightened my world. It lit me a fire for God in a whole new way that I owe a huge debt to my professor for opening that window. So for me, yeah, theology is practical just because thinking about God has really changed my life because I love God, and it is a way to express that love and to have that intimacy and connection. I also got to ask, have I seen or noticed ways that others' beliefs have impacted their lives? That some theological doctrine actually impacts or changes what someone believes? I'm going to say, yeah, especially inerrancy. How different people react to different things in our politics and the world around us. People who believe in inerrancy and don't believe in inerrancy really do react wildly different in my experience. People who theologically think that God is out there and is all powerful. And, there's a certain level of comfort to thinking that God's all powerful and knows all of time. And there's a different kind of thing for those who don't think God's all powerful and that he's actually changed his mind and he's interacting with us and personally involved and he doesn't know the future. Those people tend to have a much deeper relationship with God, but they don't have that same level of comfort knowing that God is in control. So I think that these things really do have practical, tangible ways that I've seen them impact the lives of people around me. There's also studies done. There's a science that has actually been done revolving around people who have heard different end times doctrines. And we found that some doctrines that have been taught and whatever, and again, this isn't evidence that it's true or untrue, but we have found that some people who were raised with certain thoughts about the end times have terrible mental health, and these terrible things have happened to them because they've been taught fear through end-time theology, eschatology. So if we're talking about it's practical, I don't think that God wants us to have a spirit of fear, but rather of love, joy, strength, those kind of things. So for me, I think maybe your doctrine's got to change if it's inspiring fear instead of aspiring a form to go after. So that's practical theology. We also want to think through biblical theology, going through theology just from the Bible. The Bible says a lot about God. He says a lot about Jesus, says a lot about mankind. It's not systematized. Again, Origen Plato, those were some of the first people to do that. But rather, it's taught through relationships and through mystery. So I think it's actually important, much like the Orthodox Church, as I think does really well, to not just focus on systematic theology, but also to think of theology through our relationships to one another, through our relationship to God. What do we know about God from our relationship to one another in the church? What do we know about God that is a mystery that we can't fully grasp? And why do we love that about God? Because the mystery is important. So these things that the Bible shows us about relational and mystic theology, I think are things that we need to grasp and hold tight. They're in the Bible for a reason. Systematic theology isn't in the Bible for a reason. Sit on that for a minute. I love systematic theology, but sit on that for a minute. All right. So as you know, one of the things we like to do on this show is to end with 3 questions. Not any answers, not any practical thing that you can do, but rather 3 questions. I want you to ask yourself and to struggle with these questions. Here we go. Number 1, why do you care about theology? And what impact has it made in your life? Has it made any impacts that you can think of in your own personal life? And why do you care about it? Number 2, are there any beliefs you hold on to that are bad for your mental health? And what does that imply about God if those beliefs are true? What does it mean if you have beliefs that are causing you to be unhealthy? What does that say about God? And do you have any beliefs that make you feel this way? Number 3, in what ways are you modeling after the form of Jesus in your own life? So, number 1, why do you care about theology? And what impact has it made in your life? Number 2, are there any beliefs you hold on to that are bad for your mental health? And what does that imply about God if those beliefs are true? And number 3, in what ways are you modeling after the form of Jesus in your own life? Remember, form again, that's that higher idea, that thing to ascribe, to inspire after. So those are our 3 takeaway questions today. I hope that you don't have any clear answers and you got to wrestle with them for a while, because I know I do. And I hope you're all just as confused as I am, which is a lot if you're wondering. Yeah. Hope you're all just as confused as I am, and that you're inspired to study these great theologians like Plato, Origen, even Jerome. Jerome had a lot to say about Origen and his theology. He didn't love it. Other thinkers. Think more about these guys. Study them more deeply on this topic going forward in your own faith journeys. Thank you all so much for joining this dummy on my journey to learn more about God and to love him better. And I hope you all do me a favor. Remember one very important thing, and that is to keep on struggling.
This was an Anazao Ministries podcast. If you'd like to check out other shows like this, be sure to subscribe to the network.